Welcome to the Cat-Yap Corner. We go full-on cat-yapping about things in Amtgard that did happen. Grab a teacup and napkin because the kitties are spilling the tea. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe, and remember, hit the bell to get notifications on fresh yappenings in Amtgard. Welcome to the Society of Concerned Reeves, Lesson 3 for Battle Gaming, Abilities and Ability Order. For today's topic, we're going to first break down abilities and understand how they're written, how to properly cast them to use them, and how they interact when used with other effects. And then we're lastly going to cover the difference between magic and extraordinary abilities, because the whole reason I wrote today's lesson was because like a week and a half ago, I was reading how extraordinary worked again, and I was just like, I actually don't think that this is common knowledge, because I think we all just kind of hear different regurgitations of how it works, myself included, and I was just like, I'm gonna make that the next topic because I went down a rabbit hole. This was written at the time of 8.6.3, which I know 8.6.4 literally just came out like yesterday or the day before. Nothing that is discussed today is affected by those changes, which is why I'm really glad I didn't write the one with keywords like phasing, because that just changed. So that'll probably be the next class. However, for today's, nothing has changed between 6.3 and 6.4, thankfully. So first, we're gonna go ahead and start diving into the magic system, because it'll be important to first understand the basics of how spells are written to understand how they work. So we're gonna start by mainly looking at pages 24 to 29 in the ROP. First, most abilities in Amtgard require what is known as an incantation, which is summed up as follows. A incantation is the verbal component required by some abilities that initiate their function. Before an incantation, a target must be chosen, and when used at a range greater than touch, the caster must state either the target's name or two descriptors of the target. So, for example, if I was trying to cast at Sidolphus, I might say just Sidolphus, or if I didn't know his name, I would say Healer in Blue. That would be an easy way to describe him, to let him know you are my target for the spell. These must be audible up to 50 feet or wherever the target is, whichever is closer. So, for example, if Sidolphus is 30 feet away from me, I have to be audible at least 30 feet away. If the target for the spell is self, then they must be audible up to 20 feet. So, for example, if I'm targeting myself with heal to heal myself, even though I am right next to myself, I could just mumble it to myself, you must still be audible up to 20 feet. So people are aware you are using your ability. Some additional rules for incantations include not moving your feet, stating the wording properly without more than a 2-second pause, requiring an empty hand, but that has small exceptions for things such as holding the material components for a spell. So for example, spells with material components like magic balls or enchantments. If I have a hand holding a spell strip, then I'm going to cast protection from projectiles on an allied player. It's not like I have to drop my spell strip on the ground to have an open hand and then pick it up and put it on them. You can cast with the material component for your spell. The same thing goes for spell balls, so you would hold your ice ball in your hand and go, alright, cool, the strength device of mine to invoke 3 times. Perfect. My ice ball is charged. You don't have to like drop it on the floor and then pick it up, or put it in your pocket and pick it up. A couple other things. Starting an incantation cancels any active magic balls along with any active chants. So if I am currently chanting a bard song, such as Song of Power, and I start wanting to use a different ability, then my chant that I'm using falls off. And then lastly, the target for the ability you're using must be visible and in range when the incantation is completed. If the incantation is finished, the ability is used whether the target was valid or affected. So that's a lot of information in just looking at how incantations work, which is really funny because if you look in the ROP, it's literally an entire page. I just summed it up as quickly as possible, and I know that's a lot of information, so it's going to get broken down in these next few bits, because this is really what we're here for today, ability usage. And Reeving said ability usage. Since there are so many things to keep in mind as someone uses their abilities, we're going to break it down first in the different types of abilities. There are a few different types of abilities that you can use. Those would be verbals, enchantments, magic balls, specialty arrows, metamagics, and archetypes. Now, not all of those are inherently like active abilities that you actively use, but they are still abilities nonetheless. Starting off with verbals. Verbals require an incantation to be cast, and they have an immediate effect or impart a state or ongoing effect. These effects have a default duration and will last until the duration is either fulfilled or they are removed by an outside force. So, for example, for verbals, let's say player C targets player A with Icy Blast successfully, causing player player A to become frozen for 30 seconds. We have a verbal ability. It has a default duration that inflicts a state. Player B then casts release on player A successfully. Player A becomes unfrozen. In that example, 2 verbal magic abilities are used: Icy Blast at a range with a declared target, and Release at a range of touch. So let's say you're reeving that encounter. Player C targets player A with Icy Blast successfully. They become frozen. Not much to look at there. As long as player C hasn't moved their feet, properly declared the target, said their incantation properly, player A is frozen. And of course, as long as they're in range. Player B goes to cast Released on player A. As long as they're within the touch range, whether that's actively touching or their hand is 6 inches near that player, and they're saying their incantation audible up to 20 feet without moving, awesome. Player A will become unfrozen. Moving on, next we'll have enchantments. Enchantments are ongoing effects that stay on until removed or used up. These require a material component, which is either a red, white, or yellow spell strip. Each spell strip denotes the kind of enchantment. So for example, red for offensive, white for defensive, and yellow for miscellaneous. Yellow is the weird one where it's often paired with other spell strips, or it does a weird effect such as Sleight of Mind, for example, which is a yellow spell strip that basically gives you 1 get out of jail free card for a dispel magic. It's not inherently offensive, it's not inherently defensive, it just does a weird secret third thing. Players may only carry 1 at a time, and enchantments are always worn on players regardless of what their effect is. So for example, the wording for that I know seems a little odd. That's a big clarification for things such as poison weapon. Even though your incantation literally says you are coating your weapon in a deadly poison and it affects your weapon does not wear the enchantment. You wear the enchantment. It's also funny because the wording for poison weapon says the player's next wound inflicted is affected by wounds kill. It doesn't matter which of your weapons you hit someone with. If you're fighting Florentine, for example, whatever sword hits first makes a legal hit and causes a wound is affected by wounds kill. That's one kind of benefit to remembering that it's worn on the player and not the weapon. Because if you have 2 weapons like you're fighting Florentine, poison weapon would maybe kind of suck a little more if you had to consciously keep remembering, all right, my right weapon is poison, but my left one's not. So that's how enchantments work. Obviously, with all of the abilities, there are rules that break them, because what good is having a solid foundation for your spells if you are not also breaking the rules for your spells. But next we're going to move into magic balls. This is another spell requiring a material component, which is the magic ball itself, and they have effects when they are thrown and strike a legal target. Now the clarification for legal target, and not necessarily legal hit location, comes from things such as Force Bolt. So if we look at Force Bolt here, there are a couple legal targets that Force Bolt can hit, because Force Bolt can hit a weapon, it can hit armor, it can also hit a player. So it's not necessarily it has to hit a legal hit location such as a player's leg or chest. It can also hit weapons and destroy them, or it can hit armor and affect their armor points as if it had armor breaking. That's an important thing to remember with certain spell balls such as that. Fireball. Sphere just got changed a little bit, so I'm not going to talk about Sphere today. The magic ball must be in hand when the incantation finishes, and only one may be active for a player at any given time, which, as we looked at the incantations earlier, starting a new incantation cancels other magic balls. So if I have an ice ball already charged and I start charging up a force bolt instead, my ice ball turns off, and then I have to finish charging up my force bolt to actually use it. And then lastly, these impact the first target that they strike, bounces not impacting other players, and they become inactive once striking terrain. So that's important because it's a little bit different from, like, let's say a standard arrow where bounces count and they can bounce off of the ground or off other equipment or off people, and the bounces will count. With spell balls, it just matters the first thing they hit. They fall to the ground and then happen to somehow bounce up and hit someone on the leg, doesn't count. And then lastly, they do not have engulfing unless otherwise stated. Engulfing meaning that the engulfing effect impacts the target if they strike a valid hit location, garb, or carried equipment. So everyone's favorite example of this, Ice Ball. If Ice Ball hits a player, they're frozen. If Ice Ball hits the player's shield, they're frozen. If Ice Ball hits the player's sword or their cape that they're wearing, they're frozen. So that is something really important to be looking out for as you're reeving, is when someone gets hit with an engulfing ice ball, sometimes they might not realize they got hit if they got hit on something like their weapon, their shield, or their cape. So when someone goes to say like, oh, my engulfing ice ball hit your cape, and they're like, oh, I didn't notice. Reeve? Clarify? and you go, yeah, it hit your cape. You're frozen. Sorry, dude. It's important to keep in mind. Engulfing is a little funky and weird. And also keep in mind it says valid hit location, so if an ice ball hits someone's foot that's on the ground, doesn't count. Next, we have specialty arrows, which they function really similarly to magic balls. The difference is they're an arrow instead of a ball. I wish there was more of a clarification to that, but honestly, that's all it is. Very similarly, the material component is a specialty arrow instead of a magic ball. When they strike a valid target, they can have multiple effects. They must be fired alone, and their incantation must be said immediately prior to firing. So if I'm firing a destruction arrow at someone's shield, the proper thing for me to do would be saying destruction arrow, immediately firing the arrow, and then it flies where it will. And it must be audible up to 50 feet when you say that incantation. One fun thing about specialty arrows is they are all ambulant by default, meaning you do not have to say ambulant prior to firing, and they also count as a normal arrow hit in addition to their other effects. Ambulant we're about to dive into a little bit more as we get into the meta magic section, but ambulant just means that you are able to move your feet while you are casting. So for specialty arrows, it's very important that they are ambulant, because how much would it suck if you were an archer trying to use a destruction arrow on someone charging at you and you couldn't at least even walk backwards and say destruction arrow and shoot it at someone? That would suck. The last two are the funky ones. So we have metamagics. A metamagic is an ability that alters the typical function of other abilities. These follow standard incantation rules, aside from ambulant, which allows you to cast while moving. So when casting, metamagics go after identifying the target, but before starting your ability incantation. Let's say, hypothetically, if I'm going to shove Rain in this hypothetical where he's not playing Monk for once, I would go, Rain, extension, my power shoves thee, my power shoves thee, my power shoves thee. Rain is now affected by shove. These are used the second their incantation is finished, even if the ability it modifies is not completed. As we read earlier, with incantations themselves, as long as the incantation is finished, the ability is used whether the target was valid or affected. So thinking of it this way, the metamagic's target is basically the spell, and if the spell is not finished, it doesn't matter because the metamagic's condition was already fulfilled. It tried to alter a spell. Did it succeed? Doesn't matter. You still said it. So for example, if I only have one Swift and I start going to Swift heal my friend next to me and I stop casting heal, the next time I go to do that, I cannot use Swift because I only had one. And I already said Swift. Their incantations are literally a singular word, which is why it's important to keep in mind the second I say that word, it's done, it's gone, I no longer have it. Metamagics also don't affect each other. This can get a little tricky sometimes. So I have this example. A player may say extension ambulant, begin walking, and continue casting my power makes thee frozen, my power makes thee frozen, my power makes thee frozen, cast Icy Blast on a player with a range of 50 feet instead of 20. The reason why you would say extension ambulant and then begin walking is because you can't say ambulant, start walking, extension, because metamagics do not affect other metamagics. Why? I don't know. Small balancing, I'm assuming, to make them slightly more fair, because otherwise I could in fact start sprinting at someone and yell extension ambulant. It would make it a little harder. Rather, I have to announce like ambulant extension, start walking. Gives a small delay and a little bit more reaction time for people. So that'll be something important to keep in mind, because I know that that is something that when I started trying to use ambulant, I was messing up every time I would go to use it. Regardless, metamagics are the funky things that say, would you like to break the rule of the spell? Well, now you can. So that's one instance of Amtgard going, that rule we've set up, you're allowed to cheat. Legally. Have fun. The last ability is an archetype, and before you say, are those even abilities? Technically, yes. These are class abilities that alter the base rules of their class. They are denoted with a in parentheses, and they are always active throughout the game, similar to traits. So, for example, if we look at the assassin archetype of spy, or I'm already on monk. We'll look at the monk. If I am on monk and I look at their archetype medium, it is an archetype that gives you these buffs, and then you can't have armor or great weapons. They function basically like a trait, so they would work similarly to Enlightened Soul or Missile Block. I cannot get rid of a monk's medium, that they just have it innately. So it's basically the exact same as a trait. So now we've covered what generally an ability is gonna look like in terms of the general function that the ability has and how it's used. So afterwards, each ability has a school listed next to it. When you're reading the abilities, they're gonna all be listed in this format here, where it says the classes that have access to it and the level of which they have access, the type, which is where you're going to see whether it's a verbal, an enchantment, a magic ball, whatever. Next, you're going to see the school, which is the school of magic that it lies in. The range, if any. The reason why it says range, if any, is because sometimes things have an unlimited range. The incantation and gestures, materials needed for it. So this is where your lovely material components like spell strips, magic balls, specialty arrows would go in. The effect it has, limitations or restrictions, extra notes. The school of the ability dictates where its magic comes from, and abilities from the same school typically have similar effects. The school of magic an ability is from is often in the incantation. For the ability Shatter, the incantation is, my power shatters thy body 3 times. The keyword here is power, which indicates it's from the school of sorcery. If we look at the next example, Terror, death makes thee terrified 3 times. The school it is from is the school of death. Lastly, if we look at Flame Blade, which is an enchantment, the element of fire shall infuse your weapons. The school that is from is flame. You could tell because it has fire in the incantation. For offensive magic, the incantation itself is a great way for both the caster and the target to understand what school an ability is from. As a Reeve, you're going to see this pop up a lot for instances where, let's say I am playing Wizard and I go to freeze someone with Icy Blast, and I say my power makes thee frozen 3 times at a scout. Let's say the scout has Adaptive Blessing and is immune to sorcery. If they look at you as a Reeve and they're like, what school is that from? I don't know. Do I have to take that? You might go, well, the incantation has the word power in it, so it is from the school of sorcery. Are you immune to sorcery? Yes? Then no, ignore it. That also happens a lot sometimes where people will go up to an encounter with, let's say, Adaptive Blessing, and they will announce like, all right, Adaptive Blessing, immune to sorcery. Let's say a wizard still casts on them anyways with Icy Blast. And then they go, they're not taking my Icy Blast. They're cheating. Well, what school did they say they were immune to? Sorcery. And what word did you use in your incantation? Power. Womp womp. You don't have your Icy Blast anymore. Sorry, bud. There are a few abilities that do not explicitly state their school in the incantation. This is most common in spells that are not directly targeted at enemies in combat. For example, the heal incantation is from the Spirit School, and its incant is the white light of healing have healed thee 5 times. This is also common with enchantments or other non-offensive abilities, such as, like, if we look at Enlightened Soul, a distant magic has no hold upon thy now enlightened soul. What school is that from? That's when you could look it up. Cool, I'm gonna look up Enlightened Soul. Enlightened Soul is Protection School. Protection's one of the weird schools where oftentimes Protection's not in the incant because most of the protection spells are just enchantments because that's just how they be. That's when it'll get slightly tricky. That's when it's really important for the caster of the spell to make people aware when you're giving people like enchantments or other things. Hey, this is what school it's from. The next step to understanding abilities is the range, which will be either self, touch, other, 50 feet, 20 feet, or unlimited. There are a few small exceptions to that, but typically the range is what normally as a Reeve you'll have to keep an eye on the most, because range is often the thing that gets messed up. The incant, it happens. People are learning their spells, don't know their incantation. They start saying it and they're like, wait a second, I forgot if that's correct or not. Happens all the time. The range will either be self, the target would be the caster. If I, for example, am playing and I have regeneration, I have swift heal for myself, I can only use that on myself. It's pretty self-explanatory for that. Touch. Touch may be either self or other player. You do not have to physically touch the target as long as your hand is within 6 inches of them. So if I'm casting heal on a friend, I don't have to actually smack their back and put my hand on their back. I can just hover my hand over them and heal them. That's totally fine. I'm sure no one in Florida is gonna object to touching their super sweaty friend to heal them. Another range would be other, which means the target are other players / equipment in touch range. So for example, if I have heal but only for other people, not myself, I cannot heal myself, but I can heal my buddy next to me. 20 feet, self-explanatory. Target must be within 20 feet. 50 feet. Target must be within 50 feet. I know those two are curveballs compared to the others. The importance with the range of a spell is that the range requirement must be met as the incantation is finished. So here's a few examples of how that could work. Let's say player A goes to target player B with terror, which is a default range of 20 feet. Player B runs backwards and is 30 feet away from player A as they finish the incantation. Player A's usage of terror is expended because they finished their incantation, and player B is not impacted by the ability because they are outside of the 20-foot range that it has. That's a pretty common one we see all the time. Another one, which is actually a really funny one that I learned this worked this way up in Rising Winds. from trying to release people from abilities and stuff like that. So player A is wounded on their arm. Player B begins casting the heal spell as player A is running over to them. Player A gets within touch range of player B as player B finishes the heal incantation. Player A recovers a wound, and player B expends their usage of heal. As long as player B finishes their incantation with player A within touch range, that heal works. So I can start saying the first 4 instances of the white light of healing at Field B, and as long as Rain runs over to me in time to when I finish that last line of the incantation, he recovers his arm wound. Last, we're gonna go over the category that they're in, which these are a little funky because they're not listed in the ability section. So like when I'm looking up an ability and I see this format key, the category it's in is not going to be listed there. The category is actually listed on the class. The 3 abilities they will fall into are either trait, magical, or extraordinary. So if we first look at magic classes, these are super simple. Wizards are magic users. All abilities purchased by magic users are magical abilities. The same thing applies to druid, to healer, and to bard. Where it gets a little more complicated is when we start looking at martial classes. So for instance, we're going to look at Monk because Monk gets every instance of what I'm going to explain. Monk gets 2 different traits. They get extraordinary abilities and a magical ability. It is important to note that their heal would function differently from a healer's, and I'm going to go ahead and explain why. Traits are always on and cannot be removed from the bearer in any way. They never require an incantation. You just have them. So they function how you think like maybe an enchantment would function, where it's like, cool, you just naturally get this thing, but instead of having to cast it or do anything for it, you just always have it by default. So Monk has 2. They have Enlightened Soul and they have Missile Block. Enlightened Soul, you can't be affected by verbals at a range greater than touch. Missile Block, as long as like you're blocking with your hands or I believe also a weapon in hand, then you can nullify spell balls and arrows. That used to be at level 6, now they get at level 1, which is super silly and goofy. Next, we'll go ahead and talk about magic abilities. This is what every caster will have, and also specifically for Monk, they're Resurrect. Magical abilities are magical in nature. If the definition of this ability lists as an enchantment, then it follows all the normal rules for enchantments and count towards the limit of enchantments that may be worn by a player. So magical abilities for all the casters, that's how all of your stuff works, with like normal enchantment limits, 1 per person unless your ability states otherwise, such as Sleight of Mind, which doesn't count towards the enchantment limit. Magical is pretty straightforward. It's where we start looking at extraordinary, where it gets funky and weird. Extraordinary abilities are not magical in nature. So for example, it could represent poison from a vial or using a piece of twine to fix a broken arrow. Why does it mention poison in general? Well, if we go ahead and look at Assassin, who gets poison self, 1 per life charge 3 extraordinary, their poison does not come from them conjuring like the forces of death and coating their weapon in like an evil magical ooze that makes it poisonous. An assassin takes out a vial and coats their sword in a deadly poison. Seems pretty straightforward in terms for at least the flavor reason for why that is the case. The same thing I'm pretty sure also goes for an Archer's Mend. It's the same reasoning of, cool, I'm pulling out a literal string and repair kit from my backpack and I'm fixing my bow right here. I'm not magically putting it together and repairing it. An ability that is EX that is also an enchantment generally behaves as an enchantment does, however, does not count towards the limit of enchantments that may be worn by the player. The other thing about Extraordinary is that extraordinary abilities do not require an open hand to be cast. For example, if I am playing Assassin, and let's say my buddy healer next to me wants to give me Blessing Against Wounds, I could take Blessing Against Wounds from my buddy healer, and then I can still use my own poison, because my poison is extraordinary and does not count towards my enchantment limit. Also, if I am playing Florentine Assassin and I'm going to coat my weapons in a deadly poison, I do not have to put one of my weapons on the floor in order to do that incantation. I can keep them in my hands because Extraordinary says so. So why is Extraordinary kind of weird sometimes? And there's this really fun ability that all of us love called Protection from Magic. If we all gather around the campfire and look at Protection from Magic, the type of spell, it's an enchantment. It is from the Protection School. The range is Other, so I can use this on other players, not myself. The incantation, I enchant thee with protection from magic 3 times. Material component, a white strip. The effect of this ability. Bearer is unaffected by magical abilities from any school. Upon death, the player is cursed. And then an additional note, this effect does not interact with other enchantments worn by the player. The fun bits with the effect, unaffected by magical abilities from any school. So let's say I gave a wizard protection from magic. If a healer goes to stun them, they're immune. They are immune to magical abilities. An assassin's poison is extraordinary. It is not a magical ability. Therefore, if a wizard has protection from magic, and an assassin comes up to them, hits them on the leg, and says, poison weapon wounds kill, that wizard dies, because they are immune to magical abilities, not extraordinary abilities. What if I'm playing medium and put Blessing Against Wounds EX on myself and want another enchantment? Alright, so let's go ahead and look at that, because Blessing Against Wounds, this is a very good question, by the way, and I'm pretty sure you're just asking it because we've talked about this before, so we might as well bring up the example here, because I know it was funky. Blessing Against Wounds specifically says, the effect it has, awesome, does not count towards a player's enchantment limit, may not be worn with any other enchantments from the protection school, unless the other enchantment is extraordinary. In your case, when let's say you want another enchantment, let's say the enchantment is from a school that's not protection, cool, you just get it. Because your Blessing Against Wounds as a medium monk is already extraordinary, so getting another enchantment, whatever. Let's say you want to get this and Promag. Unless that Promag is extraordinary, you cannot receive that because it's also from the protection school. Enlightened Soul. Player is unaffected by verbal, magical abilities used at a range greater than touch. And it does also add this as a note, which is very helpful. Does not affect EX abilities, abilities with the range of touch, nor abilities whose range is greater than touch but are used at range of touch anyways. Enlightened Soul does clarify, add in that extra clarification, which is really helpful. It's handy to see redundancy in the rules because obviously sometimes you will miss something if it's only written down somewhere once. Because I'm 99% sure I missed that like 80 times, especially when I started playing because I was getting so frustrated with monks. Let's say I give an assassin Enlightened Soul, and they go insubstantial. So they are currently immune to verbals at range that are magical, and they're insubstantial. If a scout looks at me and goes, Solgaleo, tracking, I still have to pop out because their tracking is extraordinary. It is not a magical ability. There's a solid example of that. A similar thing applies with Void Touched. Void Touched also has that lovely additional other clarification, is unaffected by magical abilities from sorcery, spirit, and death schools. So once again, if I am an assassin and someone slaps Void Touched on me, which give Void Touch to your assassins more often. It's so funny. But let's say I'm an assassin and I'm given Void Touched and I step into the shadows and I'm insubstantial. A scout can still track me because I am protected from magical abilities, not extraordinary abilities. That is quite funky and funny. Insult works a similar way. So Insult specifically, target is unable to attack or cast magical abilities at anyone other than the caster or their carried equipment for 30 seconds, or until either party dies. So because of the fact that it specifies magical abilities, if I insult a scout, because I'm like, ooh, I'm gonna do something super smart, I'm gonna insult the scout so my assassin can sneak past them because they can't track them. They can still track that assassin because they are using an extraordinary ability and not a magic ability. I'm also using Scout and Assassin a lot because it's just kind of the easiest to explain instance of when you think that you should be immune to something but you're not because Scouts exist and their tracking is so good.